Joseph Blackwell had buried 3 good horses, 1 faithful dog, and his mother all in the same cursed year. And still none of that grief had come close to the particular misery of sitting across the supper table from another woman he did not want to marry. The year was 1873, and the town of Harrow Creek, nestled against the red bluffs of eastern New Mexico territory, had decided collectively that Joseph Blackwell needed a wife. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way that mountains are quiet, and the sole owner of the Blackwell Ranch, which stretched across 4,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in the territory. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the collar when it grew too long, which it always did because he rarely remembered to visit the barber, and eyes the color of storm clouds over the mesa. He was, by any reasonable measure of the frontier, a fine catch. He had turned down every single one of them. There had been Clara Munson, the widow from Albuquerque whose father owned a dry goods empire and who had arrived with 17 trunks and an opinion about everything from curtain fabric to cattle breeds. Joseph had been perfectly polite, poured her tea, and then told Reverend Hayes the following Sunday that he did not think Clara Munson would be happy on a working ranch. Reverend Hayes, who was also the town's unofficial matchmaker and postmaster, had pressed his lips together and written another letter. Then came Adelaide Prout, who was 23 and charming and terrified of horses. On a cattle ranch in New Mexico territory, this was not a small inconvenience. She had screamed when one of the mares had nudged her shoulder in the corral, and that had been the end of that. After Adelaide there was Mabel Ford's, then a woman named Ruth whose last name Joseph had genuinely forgotten, and finally a schoolteacher from Santa Fe named Miss Covington who had taken one look at the state of the ranch house, declared it uninhabitable, and returned to Santa Fe on the next stage. Each time, the town of Harrow Creek clucked its collective tongue and decided Joseph Blackwell was simply too particular, too proud, or too damaged by grief to know what he needed. His foreman, a weathered Mexican man named Rodrigo Salinas, who had worked the ranch since Joseph's father was alive, had a simpler theory. "You have not met the right one," Rodrigo said one evening over coffee, not as though it required arguing but simply as a statement of existing fact, the way you might say the sky was blue or that the creek ran south. "I'm not looking for the right one," Joseph said. "That," Rodrigo replied, "is exactly when they tend to show up." Joseph had grunted and gone to bed, and the matter had rested there through the long hot summer and into the first bite of autumn. It was on a Thursday in October, when the cottonwoods along Harrow Creek had gone gold and the air carried the first real cold down from the mountains, that Reverend Hayes appeared at the ranch with a letter in his hand and an unusual expression on his face. Not his usual matchmaking enthusiasm, which tended toward the eager, something quieter, almost puzzled. "This came through the post this morning," Hayes said, handing the envelope across to Joseph on the porch. "Addressed to you. No return name." "Just this." Joseph turned the envelope over. It was plain, made of good paper, the kind that cost a little something. His name was written on the front in a careful, deliberate hand, not ornate but precise, the letters leaning slightly forward as though they were in a hurry to say something. There was no other name, no town. The postmark said Santa Fe, but that was all. He pulled out the single sheet inside. The letter contained no greeting, no sender's name, no preamble or explanation. It contained only a prayer written out in that same precise forward-leaning hand. It read, "Lord, grant me courage enough to go where I have never been, grace enough to be useful where I land, and enough good sense to know a worthy man when I find one. Keep my hand steady and my heart open. And if it pleases you, let wherever I am going feel someday like home." That was all. Joseph read it twice standing on the porch, and then a third time more slowly, and something happened in his chest that he would not have been able to name with any precision, only that it felt like a window being opened in a room that had been shut too long. "No name," he said. "None," Hayes confirmed. "I checked the envelope twice, checked with the postal office in town. Nobody knows who sent it." Joseph folded the letter back along its creases and stood looking out at the land, at the gold and copper of the cottonwoods along the creek bed, and the long red shadow of the bluff beyond his north pasture. He was not a man given to sentiment, or at least he had told himself so for a considerable number of years, but the prayer had been written by someone who was afraid and going forward anyway, and he understood that feeling in a way he could not quite shake loose. "You think someone's planning to come here?" Joseph asked. "I think," Reverend Hayes said carefully, "that someone already is." 3 weeks later, the eastbound stage from Santa Fe rolled into Harrow Creek on a cold afternoon with a thin sheet of cloud flattening the light, and among the passengers who descended onto the main street was a woman Joseph Blackwell had never seen before. She was not what the town had been expecting, though the town had not precisely been expecting anything. She was 26 years old, lean and upright in the way of someone who had been working hard her whole life and carried it like a matter of course rather than a burden. She had brown hair pinned up under a plain felt hat, and a face that was not classically beautiful in the way the illustrated magazines from back east described, but was the kind of face you kept looking at because something behind the eyes was always moving, always thinking, always deciding. She wore a dark blue traveling dress that had been good quality once and was still respectable, and she carried one trunk and a canvas bag over her shoulder. She stepped down from the stage, looked at Harrow Creek from one end to the other with the deliberate assessment of someone taking inventory, and then walked directly into the general store. Her name was Jane Atwood. She was from a small town outside of Santa Fe, where she had been teaching school for 4 years after the death of her parents left her the sole support of herself and a small piece of debt. The school had closed when the mine closed and the families had moved on, and Jane Atwood had been left with her savings, her trunk, her canvas bag, and a decision to make. She had heard about Harrow Creek from a woman she had met at a supply post, a widow named Mrs. Garces who had told her that the territory east of the mountains was growing, that there was a need for good, capable women who weren't afraid of the land, and that there was, specifically, a cattle ranch outside of town whose owner had been left to run the thing without proper management of the household side for going on 3 years. Jane had not come as a prospective bride. She had been absolutely clear with herself on that point. She had come because she needed employment and a roof, and because the prayer she had written one sleepless night and sent on an impulse she still could not fully explain had felt like something she was supposed to do. She had addressed it to Joseph Blackwell because Mrs. Garces had mentioned his name in the same breath as the ranch, and because in her tired and honest heart she had needed to send her courage somewhere real rather than just up into the general air. She had not signed it because she had not yet decided who she was in this new chapter, and signing a letter to a stranger felt like making a promise she wasn't ready to make. She bought 2 tins of sardines, a small bag of flour, and a square of hard cheese at the general store, introduced herself to the proprietor, a heavy-set man named Clem Burke who looked her over with frank curiosity, and told her the town had one boarding house run by a Mrs. Ida Parcell on the south end of Main Street. She found the boarding house. She rented a room. She ate sardines and cheese sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, and looked at the ceiling and told herself she had done the right thing, which was something she had to tell herself fairly firmly before she believed it. The following morning, she put on her second-best dress, which was a brown wool that was warmer than the blue one, pinned her hair up neatly, and walked out to the Blackwell Ranch. It was 4 miles, and she walked all of it because she did not yet have a horse and could not afford to hire the livery. The road ran out alongside the creek for a while and then cut up across open grassland, and the Blackwell land announced itself before she reached the gate by simply being more orderly than the land around it, the fence lined straight, the pastures divided into sensible sections, the cattle she could see in the south field fat and calm. Whoever ran this ranch, she thought, was not careless. The ranch house itself was a long single-story structure built from adobe and timber, solid and unadorned, with a covered porch running the full front length and two large cottonwoods on either side that had been there long enough to be genuinely impressive. There was a barn behind and to the right, a bunkhouse further back, and various outbuildings in states of reasonable repair. There was a man on the porch. He was standing, not sitting, with a coffee cup in one hand and the other resting on the porch rail, looking out at the south pasture. He had not heard her come up the road yet, or if he had not yet decided to turn around. He was tall, wide through the shoulders, and wore a dark canvas coat over a flannel shirt. His hat was pushed back slightly, the way men wear hats when they are thinking rather than working. Jane stopped at the gate. She took a breath. She thought about the prayer she had written and sent, the one that had asked for courage enough to go where she had never been, and she opened the gate. The sound of it brought him around. Joseph Blackwell looked at her across the distance of the yard, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He had a face that was weathered from years of sun and wind but not harshened by it, the kind of face that had started out handsome and been made more so by the character that living had pressed into it. He was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read, not unfriendly but not yet warm, more like a man trying to work something out. She walked up to the porch. She stopped at the bottom step. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, "my name is Jane Atwood. I have heard you have need of a capable hand for the household management of this ranch. I am a good cook, I keep clean accounts, I am not afraid of work or weather, and I am looking for a position. If you have 15 minutes, I would appreciate the chance to make my case." Joseph looked at her for a long moment. He had the quality of stillness she had already noticed from a distance, the kind that came from a man who had learned to think before he spoke. "You walked out from town," he said. "I did. That's 4 miles. "I am aware," she said. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across his face, not completing the journey but making its intentions known. He lifted the coffee cup briefly in a gesture that was half acknowledgement and half invitation. "Come up and sit down," he said. "I'll hear you out." She came up the porch steps and sat in one of the 2 plain wooden chairs, and he leaned against the rail rather than sitting, which she took as the habit of a man who was more comfortable on his feet. He called into the house, and a moment later a short Mexican woman who introduced herself as Pillar, the cook, came out with a second coffee cup and handed it to Jane without ceremony. "Tell me about your experience," Joseph said. Jane told him plainly. She had run a household of 7 from the age of 16 when her mother had fallen ill, managed the family accounts, taught school for 4 years, kept her own budget through leaner times than most people in comfortable houses could imagine, and had grown up on the edge of ranch country and understood what the work demanded even if she had not done it herself in an official capacity. She did not embellish. She did not soften the rougher parts. She told him what she was and what she could do, and then she stopped. He was quiet for a moment. "The last 3 women who came here to take the housekeeper position," he said, "left inside of 2 weeks. One because the work was harder than she expected, one because a rattlesnake got into the kitchen garden and she took that personally, and one because she and I had a fundamental disagreement about the proper role of a ranch housekeeper, which in her view included considerably more socializing and considerably less actual housekeeping than I required. I am not afraid of snakes," Jane said. "I have handled accounts under pressure, and I am not here to socialize, I am here to work." Another long pause. He was watching her with those storm cloud eyes, and she held his gaze steadily because she had learned a long time ago that looking away first was the same as admitting you were less certain than you were. "The position pays $12 a month plus room and board," he said at last. "The room is small. Meals are taken with the household. You'd be managing the house, the kitchen garden, the household accounts, and whatever else comes up that falls under that general heading. The work is not light." "I did not come looking for light work," Jane said. "No," he said, studying her. "I don't imagine you did." He hired her. The room was indeed small, tucked at the eastern end of the house with a single window that looked toward the bluff. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, a small writing table, and a hook behind the door. Jane unpacked her trunk with the efficiency of someone who had moved enough times to know that the pleasure of a new place was in the making of it, not the waiting for it to feel like home. She started work the following morning at first light. The kitchen was large and solidly equipped, and Pillar, who had been managing both the cooking and the household cleaning by herself and was visibly exhausted by the division of her own energies, received Jane with something close to relief, though she was too proud to say so directly. They worked out a partnership by the end of the first morning through a combination of English and Pillar's limited but practical English, dividing responsibilities with the pragmatic efficiency of two people who both simply wanted things to run well. The accounts were a more complicated matter. The ranch's finances were kept by Rodrigo, who was competent enough with the cattle records, but had been using a ledger system for household expenses that Jane privately thought had been designed by a man who had never tried to track the difference between necessary and optional spending. She sat at the kitchen table that first evening and went through 3 months of entries and found 2 billing errors from the general store, one repeated charge from the farrier for work that, according to the work log, had never been done, and a pattern of overordering on certain supplies while underordering on others that was costing money in waste on one end and emergency purchases on the other. She brought her findings to Joseph the next morning. He was at the barn, working alongside 2 of the ranch hands on a fence section that needed reinforcement, and he looked up when she came across the yard. She handed him the ledger with the corrections noted in the margins in her precise handwriting and gave him the brief version of what she had found. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. He went through the entries she had marked with the focused attention of a man who took money seriously, which on a working ranch was everyone. "You found this in one evening," he said. "It was not difficult. The errors were not hidden. They just required someone looking carefully." "Rodrigo has been keeping these books for 12 years. Rodrigo is excellent with cattle," Jane said diplomatically. "These are not cattle," he almost laughed. She could see it, the brief brightness at the corners of his eyes, the way his chest moved and then settled, as though he had practiced not laughing too freely. He handed the ledger back to her. "Fix it," he said, "and put the household accounts under your name going forward." She nodded and turned back to the house. She was halfway across the yard when he said, "Miss Atwood." She stopped. "Thank you," he said. "It came out simply, with nothing complicated around it." "It is what you are paying me for," she said, and kept walking. But she was smiling by the time she got back to the kitchen, and she stayed turned away from the barn long enough to be sure the smile had settled before she went inside. The weeks that followed established themselves into a rhythm that Jane found, to her genuine surprise, deeply satisfying. She rose before the rest of the household, made the morning coffee, oversaw the breakfast, managed the kitchen garden through the last of the autumn growing season, and spent the afternoons on accounts and correspondence, and the 100 small organizational tasks that had apparently gone unaddressed for the better part of 3 years. She learned the ranch the way she had always learned things, by paying attention. She learned that the 2 main ranch hands, a young man named Percy who was 19 and enthusiastic, and an older man named Walt who had been doing this work for 30 years and spoke sparingly but always worth hearing, had a running disagreement about the best way to manage the south fence line that had been going on since before she arrived and would likely continue after she left. She learned that Pillar had a cat named Domingo who was technically not allowed in the kitchen, but was in fact always in the kitchen. She learned that Rodrigo was quietly devout and said a rosary every evening on the bunkhouse steps, and that this was not a thing anyone mentioned or made any fuss about. It was simply part of the order of the ranch. She learned that Joseph Blackwell rose before dawn every single morning, that he was always the last to leave the land in the evening, that he ate everything put in front of him without complaint, that he read when he could, that he had a small shelf of books in the main room that included a battered Bible, 2 volumes on cattle husbandry, a book of poetry she was surprised to see, and a novel with a cracked spine that she recognized as one she had also read. She learned that he never raised his voice, that he was patient with Percy's mistakes in the way that patient men are, without performance, and that when he made a decision about the ranch, he made it and did not revisit it unless presented with a genuinely good reason. She learned that he watched her work sometimes, from across the yard or through the window when she was in the garden, not in the uncomfortable way of men who watch women without permission, but with the focused attention of someone trying to understand something. She could feel it without seeing it, and it did not make her uncomfortable. It made her want to be exactly as capable as she presented herself to be, which was exactly as capable as she actually was, and there was something quietly satisfying about that. One evening in November, Joseph was in the main room with the lamp on and one of his cattle books open in his lap, and Jane was at the writing table going over the month's household accounts, and neither of them was speaking, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that 2 people who have learned to exist in the same space without performance settle into. He said, without looking up from his book, "Where did you come from before Santa Fe?" She set down her pen. "A small place called Arroyo Seco in the mountains north of there. My father ran a small freight operation. My mother kept school. You learned to teach from her." "I learned most things from her," Jane said. "She was the most organized person I have ever known. She could run a household of 7 on what most people would consider next to nothing and do it without any of us feeling the tightness of it. She is gone now." It was not quite a question. "Both of them," Jane said, 3 years ago. Fever came through in the spring and took them both in the same week. I stayed through the summer to settle the affairs and then took the teaching position in Santa Fe when it came available." He was quiet for a moment. "I lost my father 4 years ago, my mother this past spring." "I know," she said. "Mrs. Garces told me." He looked up at that. "You knew about this ranch before you came." "I knew a ranch existed and that the owner had been running it alone for some time. That is all I knew." He held her gaze. In the lamplight his eyes were more gray than she had thought, with the kind of depth that made you feel a question was being asked even when none had been spoken. "The letter," he said. She did not pretend not to know what he meant. She had been waiting for this, had known since the day she arrived that it would come eventually. She had rehearsed various versions of an explanation and had discarded all of them because none of them were fully honest, and she had made a private decision that with this man in this place she was going to be honest. "That was mine," she said. Something moved across his face, a series of things, surprise first and then something softer and harder to name. He closed the book. "You wrote it." "I did. One night when I was sitting in my rented room in Santa Fe, and I had just made the decision to come here, and I needed to say the prayer out loud, or as near to out loud as writing is, and I needed to send it somewhere real so it felt true. I addressed it to you because you were the most real thing I had in connection to this place." She paused. "I did not sign it because I did not want you to be expecting anyone in particular. I wanted to come or not come on my own terms." He was looking at her the way he had looked at her that first day across the yard, working something out. "You came looking for work," he said, "not a husband." "Yes. The other women who came through here were looking for a husband." "I know." "I am sorry for the implication." "Don't apologize," he said, and there was something in his voice that had changed, something warmer, though he had not moved toward her or shifted anything obvious. It was in the quality of the silence that followed. "It is the first honest thing anyone has sent me in a considerable while." She looked at him across the room, across the lamplight, across whatever careful distance she had been keeping between herself, and the fact that she found this man deeply interesting in ways that were not purely professional. "I meant every word of it," she said quietly. "I know you did," he said. "That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about." She picked up her pen and looked back at the accounts, and he opened his book again, and neither of them said anything more that evening. But the room felt different after that, as though something had been opened, and neither of them was quite sure yet what was going to come through. The winter came to Harrow Creek with the serious intention of a season that means to be felt. The first real snow fell in December, not the polite dusting of the lower elevations but the genuine blanket of the higher country, and the ranch pulled in on itself in the way that working ranches do, everything tightening toward the essentials. The cattle moved to the winter pastures, the supplies checked and cataloged, the routine stripped down to what was necessary. Joseph spent those first hard weeks of winter in a state of mild and unexamined restlessness that Rodrigo noticed and did not comment on, which was how Rodrigo handled most things he noticed. Percy noticed it too and had considerably less restraint, mentioning to Walt one morning in the barn that the boss seemed like a man with something on his mind, which Walt received with the flat silence it deserved. What was on Joseph's mind was Jane Atwood. He would not have claimed it was more than that for some weeks, because he was a man who moved slowly in matters of the interior, who tested the ground before he put weight on it. But he thought about her with a frequency that exceeded anything that could be reasonably attributed to professional interest, and the house felt different with her in it, not merely more organized, which it was, but more alive. She had a habit of humming when she worked, not loudly, not consciously, just a low thread of melody that moved through the house the way good light does. You only noticed it when it wasn't there. She asked questions that were good questions, the kind that showed she had already thought 3 steps ahead before she spoke. She was funny in the dry, quiet way of people who are funny without trying to be, saying things with a perfectly straight face that made you realize a moment later you were grinning. She had been there 6 weeks when she asked him if she could plant a winter kitchen garden in the lean-to on the south side of the house, which caught enough sun even in December to grow certain things if you managed it right. He said yes before she had finished explaining why, and then had to pretend he'd been listening to the whole explanation. She planted it that same afternoon, kneeling in the cold soil with a methodical focus he found, unreasonably, quite beautiful to watch. December deepened. There was a Christmas gathering at Reverend Hayes's house in town, and the whole ranch attended, which was the custom. Jane wore the dark blue dress and her hair down for the first time since she had arrived, pinned back simply with a plain comb, and Joseph saw her across Hayes's crowded front room and thought that he was in considerably more trouble than he had allowed himself to admit. He got her a glass of hot cider and stood beside her while Hayes's wife played carols on an old upright piano, and they talked in the low, easy way they had developed of talking, about the ranch mostly, about Percy's improving skills with a lasso, about the cattle they were planning to sell in the spring, and about a novel Jane had found on Joseph's shelf and borrowed and wanted to discuss. "You disagree with the ending," he said. "I think it was honest," she said. "I did not say I agreed with it. Honest endings are not always satisfying." "No," she said, "but they are true, and I would rather have something true than something comfortable." He looked at her in the warm lamplight of Hayes's crowded room and said, "So would I." They rode back to the ranch in the wagon together, the other ranch hands ahead on their horses in the cold dark, the stars very sharp above them, and they were both quiet for most of the ride. Halfway home, Jane said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," he said. "All those women before, the ones they sent, why none of them?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because I felt nothing, not unkindness, not dislike, just nothing. And it seemed wrong to build a life on nothing when a man knows what something feels like, even if he hasn't felt it in a long time." She looked ahead at the dark road. The cold was sharp and honest. "What does something feel like?" she said, and her voice was very level. He did not answer right away. Then he said, "Like not being able to stop thinking about a prayer someone sent with no name." The silence after that was different from all the silences before it. It was the kind that changes things, that sits down in the space between two people and makes itself at home. When they reached the ranch, he helped her down from the wagon, which was simply what you did, and when she was down she was standing close and she looked up at him in the dark with those steady knowing eyes and said, Joseph. It was the first time she had used his given name. He said Jane, and it came out very quietly with something in it he hadn't planned. She said good night. She went inside. He stood in the cold yard for a while looking at the stars, and Rodrigo, who was unsaddling his horse at the barn, looked over once and said nothing, because he was a wise man and had been waiting for this for some weeks. January in Harrow Creek was cold enough to mean it, and the work of the ranch contracted further around the essential warmth of the daily tasks. Jane had by now learned enough about the outside work to be useful beyond the house when needed, and she had quietly begun accompanying Rodrigo on the morning rounds of the south pasture, not from any particular mandate, but because she found the land compelling and wanted to understand all of it, not just the domestic portion. Rodrigo, for his part, accepted her company with the equanimity of a man who had been observing women run things competently for his entire life and saw nothing remarkable about it. It was on one of these morning rounds in late January that they came across the problem. A section of the north fence line, the one that separated the Blackwell land from the adjacent territory owned by a man named Cal Driscoll, was down. Not storm-damaged, not weakened by age, but cut. 3 sections of good wire clipped clean. Jane looked at the clean ends of the cut wire and then at Rodrigo. "Driscoll," she said. Rodrigo's expression was neutral in the way of a man conserving his words for when they would matter. He has been unhappy about the eastern boundary since Joseph's father drew the deed. He does not always express his unhappiness through conversation. "Has any cattle gotten through? We should count." They counted. 3 head of Blackwell cattle had wandered onto Driscoll's land, which in the logic of certain frontier men meant they became Driscoll's cattle. Jane and Rodrigo rode the fence line back to the house, and Jane went directly to find Joseph. He was in the barn. She told him plainly what she had found. His face went still in the particular way it went still when he was controlling something, a tightening at the jaw, a steadiness in the eyes that was making a decision not to become anger. He sent Percy for the cattle, rode out himself to assess the fence, and then, rather than going directly to Driscoll's ranch, he went to town first and spoke to the territorial land agent about the boundary record. Jane had suggested this without suggesting it directly, simply saying over coffee that morning that a man who already had a grievance about boundaries was going to say the cattle walked over on their own accord, and the only argument worth having was one backed by the official record. Joseph had looked at her steadily and then nodded and gone to town in that order. He came back in the afternoon with a copy of the official survey and a calm resolution to the matter that involved presenting Driscoll with the legal document and 3 witnesses, which meant the conversation never escalated past the uncomfortable, and the cattle were returned by the following morning. Driscoll was not pleased, but he was also not stupid, and the presence of documentation made foolishness expensive. That evening, Joseph came to find Jane where she was working in the kitchen after supper, checking the month's provisioning list. He leaned against the doorframe with his arms folded and looked at her. "The survey record," he said, "that was your idea." "It was a logical step," she said. "A lot of men in my position would have ridden straight to Driscoll's ranch first." "A lot of men would have," she agreed. He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you, Jane." She looked up from the provisioning list. He was still in the doorway, and the kitchen lamp was between them, and he looked tired in the way that men look tired when they have been carrying something too long, and some of it has just been lifted. She wanted very much to say something that would land correctly, that would be honest without being too much. She said, "This is a good ranch. It is worth protecting with good sense." "It is," he said. "It's worth a great deal more than I sometimes remember to value." He pushed off the doorframe and went toward the main room, and then he stopped. "Would you walk with me tomorrow morning, before the rounds? There's a place on the north end of the property I want to show you. It's better seen early." She said yes without hesitation, and the yes sat in the room like a lamp being lit. They walked the next morning before full sunrise. when the sky was the particular layered blue that belongs only to the hour just before the sun clears the horizon, the land still gray and pearl and very quiet. He took her up past the north pasture and along a trail that climbed the low slope behind the cottonwood grove, and then opened out onto a ridge with a view that made her breath stop. From the ridge you could see the whole valley, the ranch below with its ordered fields and the thread of the creek catching what light was coming, the red bluffs to the east turning gold at their tops as the sun began to find them, and beyond them the faint suggestion of the mountains, blue and enormous and permanent. "My father brought me here when I was 8, Joseph said. He was standing beside her at the edge of the ridge, his hat in his hand. He said that a man who owns land should always know it from its highest point so he can remember what he is responsible for." Jane looked out over the valley and felt something settle in her that had been traveling for a long time and needed to come to rest. "He was right," she said. "He usually was," Joseph said quietly. "I wish he were here to see it still standing." She looked at him. He was looking out at the valley with an expression she recognized, the expression of a person who carries love for someone who is gone and has not yet found quite the right place to set it down. "He would see it in you," she said. "The fact that it is still standing." He looked at her then. The sun was just beginning to come over the bluffs and it caught the side of her face and turned her brown eyes amber and gold. And Joseph Blackwell, standing on that ridge in the January cold with the whole of his land spread out below him, felt something complete itself that had been unfinished for a very long time. He said, "Jane." She said, "Yes," not as an answer to a question but as a presence, as though the word meant I am here, I am listening, I am not going anywhere. He reached over and took her hand. His hand was large and work-roughened and warm despite the cold, and she turned hers to meet it, and they stood on the ridge watching the sun come up over the valley and said nothing more for a long time, because nothing more needed to be said yet. When they came back down to the ranch for breakfast, Rodrigo was standing at the barn door drinking his morning coffee, and he looked at them both with the expression of a man who has been proven right and is too dignified to say so. He just nodded and went back to the barn. February brought a thaw that was not quite a thaw, the snow retreating from the lower elevations while the mountains stayed white, and the ranch eased back into its spring preparations with the industry of a place that had been waiting for this moment through the cold months. New calves were coming. The fences were being assessed for winter damage. The kitchen garden in the Linta had produced a surprising amount of winter spinach that Pillar had received with genuine pleasure. Joseph and Jane had moved into a new kind of closeness that was not yet declared, or not yet publicly, though the ranch had formed its own quiet consensus. They still maintained the formality of their respective positions for the sake of propriety, but in the evenings they sat together in the main room more often than not, sometimes talking, sometimes reading in the comfortable shared silence they had long since established, and sometimes Joseph would look up from whatever he was doing and find Jane watching him, and neither of them would look away. He had almost kissed her twice and had stopped himself both times, not from lack of wanting, but from a careful internal argument about whether he had the right yet, whether he had said enough of what needed to be said. The argument settled itself one Sunday afternoon in late February, when a rider came out from town with news that Reverend Hayes had arranged another prospective match for Joseph, a woman from back east who would be arriving on the spring stage, the arrangement apparently having been set in motion before Jane's arrival, and now chugging along under its own momentum. Joseph received this news in the yard with an expression that could only be described as a man who has just discovered a complication that he finds not complicated at all. He went directly to the house and found Jane in the kitchen, and he said, "Hayes has sent another woman." Jane looked up from the bread she was kneading. She kept her face very still. "I see," she said. "I'm going to write to Hayes today and tell him to stop," Joseph said. "But I wanted to tell you that first. I wanted you to know that before I put pen to paper." She looked at him steadily. The flour was on her hands and her hair had come loose a little at the temple, and she looked in that moment so exactly like herself, so complete and real and present, that he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stood directly in front of her. "I am not," he said, "looking for a bride that Hayes can send me. I am looking at the only woman I have any interest in standing in front of. And I would like to know if you are going to stand there and look at me like that much longer without telling me what you are thinking." Jane set her hands flat on the kitchen table and looked up at him with eyes that were very bright. "I am thinking," she said slowly, "that you are about 2 months late saying that." He put one hand against her cheek, his thumb brushing the flour she had left there, and he kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kind that has been building for months and knows exactly what it is doing. She kissed him back with the same certainty, her flour-dusted hands coming up to hold the front of his coat, and when they drew back they were both quiet for a moment, with the particular quiet of something that has just changed everything. "I am going to write to Hayes," he said. "You said that already," she said. "I am going to write it now." "Then go write it," she said, and she was smiling, not the small careful smile she usually deployed, but the full one that he had been trying to earn for months, the one that was all of her, and it was worth every one of the months. He wrote to Hayes. He also, in the same letter, informed Hayes that if the woman from back east had not yet departed, he was sorry for her trouble, and he would make a contribution to the cost of her return stage, but that the matter of his marital future was now no longer under Hayes's management. Hayes received this letter with a great deal of huffing and 3 days of affront, after which he came around, as Hayes always came around, and arrived at the ranch on a Sunday with his hat in his hand and congratulations on his lips. "I knew it," Hayes said, shaking Joseph's hand with excessive enthusiasm. "I knew that prayer was something, had a feeling the moment I saw it." "You had no idea what it meant," Joseph said. "I had a spiritual feeling," Hayes said with dignity. Jane, who was standing beside Joseph on the porch, said, "Would you like coffee, Reverend Hayes?" with the exact degree of warmth that closed the subject without dismissing the man, and Hayes accepted the coffee, and they all sat on the porch in the pale winter sun, and nobody brought up the 7 women who had come before. It was March when Joseph asked her properly. Not on the ridge, though that had occurred to him, because the ridge was the place he took things he needed perspective on, and this was something he was clear on without needing perspective. He asked her in the kitchen garden, of all places, on a Thursday morning when she was planting the first of the spring seeds, and he was supposedly checking the garden fence for damage and was actually thinking about the best way to say something that had no best way, that required only honesty. He said, "Jane." She looked up from the seed row she was pressing into the soil. She had a smudge of dark earth on her chin, and she had not noticed. He went down on one knee right there in the garden, which surprised her so much that she sat back on her heels and stared at him. "I am not a man who says things in the most eloquent way available," he said. "I know that. But I know what I want, which is you. I want you here. Not as the housekeeper, not as a convenient arrangement. I want to marry you, Jane, because you are the most honest person I have ever met, and because this place makes more sense with you in it, and because I have been sitting on that ridge of mine looking out at the whole of what I am responsible for, and the only thing I want to add to the view is knowing you will still be standing next to me when I look at it." She was very still. "You wrote a prayer about finding a worthy man," he said. "I do not know if I am that precisely, but I intend to spend a considerable amount of time trying to be, if you will let me." Jane Atwood looked at him kneeling in the spring mud of the kitchen garden with the complete seriousness and the smudge of earth on his coat where his knee had come down, and her eyes were very bright and her hands were pressed together in front of her, still holding the packet of seeds. "Get up," she said gently, "before you ruin those trousers." "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is a very firm yes," she said. "Please get up." He got up and she stood, and he pulled her into his arms right there in the garden, and held her with the kind of hold that means something has been found that was missing for a long time, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed him in, the smell of cold air and horses and coffee, the smell of everything this place was, and it smelled like home. They were married on the first Saturday of May, 1874, in Reverend Hayes's small white church in Harrow Creek. It was not a grand ceremony. Jane wore the dark blue dress with a white ribbon at the collar that Pillar had insisted on adding, and Joseph wore his good black coat that fit him through the shoulders as though it had been made for the purpose of this specific moment. The whole ranch attended, Rodrigo in his Sunday hat, Percy with his hair slicked back so severely it appeared to be a separate project from his usual self, Walt in the back pew looking as near to moved as Walt ever looked. Clem Burke from the general store came. Mrs. Ida Parcell from the boarding house came. A fair portion of Harrow Creek came, because a wedding was a good reason to gather, and Joseph Blackwell's wedding in particular had been the subject of considerable speculative discussion for long enough that actually witnessing it was a satisfaction. Jane walked up the aisle alone because she had no father to bring her, and she walked it the way she walked everything, directly and without flinching, with her head up and her eyes on the man standing at the front of the church who was watching her come toward him with an expression that was so unguarded in its plainness that Mrs. Parcell pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. They said the vows. Jane's voice was steady and warm. Joseph's was quiet and certain. When Hayes pronounced them married, Joseph put his hands on her face very carefully, as though she were something precious he had nearly missed, and kissed her. The church made a sound that was half cheer and half something softer. Afterward there was food at the church hall, and someone produced a fiddle, and someone else a guitar, and Rodrigo danced with Pillar with the ease of two people who have danced together before at other celebrations, and need no instruction from the occasion. Percy danced with every woman present in turn, and managed to step on most of their feet. Jane danced with Joseph, who was not a practiced dancer, but was graceful in the way that physically coordinated men are, following the music rather than the steps, and she put her head against his shoulder at some point, and he put his cheek against her hair, and they turned slowly while the fiddle played something that had no name or that no one present could agree on the name of, and it did not matter. They went home to the ranch as the sun was going down, the two of them alone in the wagon, the rest of the ranch hands having given them the evening with tact. The ranch looked exactly as it always looked at evening, the cottonwoods dark against the sky, the light from the windows of the house warm in the blue dusk, the horses settled in the pasture. It looked like itself, and Jane looked at it and thought, "This is mine now, I am part of this." Joseph helped her down from the wagon and stood holding her hand in the yard for a moment, looking at the same thing she was looking at. "Welcome home," he said. "I mean it properly this time." "I know you do," she said. Summer came to Harrow Creek the way it always did, like something that had decided to be thorough about it. The heat pressing down from a sky that was so blue it looked painted, the land going gold and dry at the edges, while the creek kept the cottonwoods green. The ranch moved into the long industry of summer cattle management, the drives to water, the fence checks in the heat of the afternoon, the slow work of keeping everything alive and growing under a sun that took no particular interest in your plans. Jane ran the house with the comfortable authority of ownership now, which changed some things that needed changing and confirmed others that had already been right. She expanded the kitchen garden significantly in the spring, converting a section of the south yard that had been growing nothing to a proper productive garden with rows of beans, squash, peppers, and corn that supplied the ranch table through the summer and into the fall. She negotiated a better rate with Burke's General Store by agreeing to supply them with surplus garden produce, which gave the ranch a small additional income and gave Burke's customers fresh vegetables through the growing season, which was not nothing in a frontier town. She wrote letters. She wrote to Mrs. Garces, who had set all of this in motion with a conversation at a supply post, and deserved to know how it had turned out, and Mrs. Garces wrote back with enough warmth and delight to fill 2 pages and a postscript. She wrote to a former student in Santa Fe who was struggling with a difficult family situation and needed guidance, and she wrote to a schoolteacher friend who was thinking about moving west and needed honest information about what the territory was actually like rather than what the illustrated papers said it was. She had been thinking about the school. Harrow Creek had no school. There were 12 children of school age in town and the surrounding ranches, and they were getting their learning in fits and starts from whoever was willing and available, which was rarely sufficient and never consistent. Jane had noticed this in her first weeks in town and had filed it under the heading of things she was not yet in a position to address. By summer, she was in a different position. She raised the subject with Joseph one evening on the porch, the two of them sitting in the late heat with cold water from the well, watching the sun drop toward the bluffs. He listened to the whole of what she wanted to do, which was organize a subscription among the ranching families and the town to support a school, find or convert a suitable building, and teach there herself 3 mornings a week until a permanent teacher could be found and compensated. When she finished, he said, "You want to teach again?" "I want the children in this area to have a school," she said, "and I am a teacher. It seems like the use of what is available." He was quiet for a moment. 3 mornings a week. What about the ranch? "Pillar can manage the mornings with the additional help I have arranged," she said. She had in fact already spoken with a girl from town named Consuelo who was looking for light work and had good common sense. "The accounts can be done in the afternoons. I have worked it out." He looked at her sideways with that almost smile. "You have worked it out?" "I have worked it out," she confirmed. "Then work it out," he said, "on one condition." She raised an eyebrow. "That you tell me what you need from me to make it happen and let me help." She smiled. "The building," she said. "There is an unused storage building on the south end of Main Street that Burke owns and does not use. If you were to speak with Clem Burke about lending it for the purpose, I think he would say yes to you before he finished hearing the sentence." "You think I have that kind of influence with Clem Burke?" "You are his best customer and you have been for 10 years, she said. "You have exactly that kind of influence with Clem Burke." Joseph spoke to Clem Burke the following morning. Burke said yes before finishing the sentence, exactly as Jane had predicted. Joseph came home and reported this to her with the expression of a man who is developing a genuine appreciation for his wife's understanding of social mechanics. "You are going to be very useful to this town," he said. "I am already useful to this ranch," she said placidly. "The town is simply additional." The school opened in September of that year, in a building that a collection of volunteer hands had cleaned, whitewashed, and furnished with benches, and a blackboard that Joseph had ordered from a supply house in Albuquerque. 14 children came on the first day, which was 2 more than Jane had planned for, and she accommodated them without visible adjustment, and sent a note home to their parents that the following week she would require 2 additional benches and a volunteer to help manage the younger ones. The town of Harrow Creek took to the school with the enthusiasm of a community that had been waiting for something like this, without knowing quite how to ask for it. By October, there were evening reading lessons for 3 of the ranch hands who had been too proud to mention they couldn't read. By November, a mother named Rosa Sandoval, who had been educated in Mexico City before circumstances had brought her family to New Mexico territory, was helping with the Spanish-speaking children, and the school had developed an informal dual-language component that was more practical than pedagogical and suited the actual population of the territory considerably better than the purely English curriculum the illustrated papers assumed was appropriate. Jane came home from teaching on a Tuesday afternoon in October, the day having been longer than expected due to a dispute among the older children about a geography question that had required her to produce the actual atlas to settle, and found Joseph at the gate waiting for her. This was not unusual. Since the school had started, he often met her at the gate on the days she taught. But today he had an expression that she had learned to read as something being quietly held, something he was managing with deliberate care. She said, "What is it?" He said, "Come inside." She went inside. She sat in the kitchen and he sat across from her, and he told her plainly that he had received word from the Territorial Land Administration that morning. Cal Driscoll had filed an official complaint about the eastern boundary of the Blackwell land, claiming that the original survey had been inaccurate and that a portion of the north pasture, specifically the portion with the ridge, was in dispute. Jane's hands, which had been folded on the table, went very still. "He is claiming the ridge," she said. "He is claiming a strip of land that includes it," Joseph said. "The complaint has been filed with the territorial administrator in Santa Fe. It will take months to resolve through proper channels, and in the meantime he has placed markers and is claiming grazing rights to the disputed section." She looked at him carefully. He was holding himself very controlled, and she could see what was underneath the control, the deep particular anger of a man who has been told that something his father built and he has maintained with care is being taken, possibly, through the machinations of paperwork and legal maneuver. "The original survey record," she said. "The one you got from the land agent last winter. It is the same record Driscoll is disputing." "Then we need the original field survey," she said, "not the administrative copy. The field notes from when the survey was done. Where was it done? Who did it?" He stared at her. "I don't know. It was done before I was born." "Then we find out," she said. "The Territorial Records Office in Santa Fe will have the original surveyor's notes and field markers. A field survey from a licensed territorial surveyor carries more legal weight than an administrative copy because it contains the physical marker descriptions. If the original markers still exist on the ground, a current surveyor can confirm them and Driscoll's claim falls apart." He was looking at her with that expression she loved, the one that was both admiring and amused and a little helpless all at once. "How do you know this?" he said. "My father ran a freight operation," she said. "Land disputes were a common subject of conversation at our supper table. What you need is a lawyer in Santa Fe and access to the territorial records. Do you know anyone in Santa Fe?" "I know a man there," he said slowly. "A lawyer named Harmon. My father used him once for a property matter." "Write to Harmon today," she said. "Tell him what you need. Tell him to go to the Territorial Records Office and find the original field survey for this property, and to document the marker locations. Then we hire a current surveyor to come out and verify the markers." Joseph sat back. He looked at her with that full, quiet gravity he had when something was settling into place. "You are extraordinary," he said. "I am practical," she said, "which is sometimes the same thing." They wrote to Harmon that evening together, Jane drafting the letter and Joseph reviewing it and adding 3 details she had not known, the letter going out on the Morning Post. Harmon, who turned out to be a compact and thorough man with a reputation for not losing boundary disputes, found the original survey field notes in 2 weeks and dispatched a surveyor to Harrow Creek the following month. The surveyor spent 4 days on the property, tramping the fence lines and the ridge and the creek bed, and when he was done, he produced a document that placed the original markers with clear precision. 2 of the original iron stakes that the first surveyor had driven were still in the ground, one at the creek crossing and one at the northeast corner, and they matched the field notes exactly. The ridge was 30 yards inside the Blackwell property line. It had never been in dispute except in Cal Driscoll's telling. The territorial administrator in Santa Fe reviewed the findings and dismissed Driscoll's complaint in March of 1875. Driscoll did not contest it, which suggested to Jane, and she said so to Joseph, that he had known all along the claim was weak and had been hoping for an uncontested settlement rather than a genuine legal victory. Joseph took her up to the ridge the morning they received the administrator's ruling. They stood at the top with the winter sun on their faces and the valley spread below, and he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and he said quietly, "My father would have liked you very much." She put her hand over his on her shoulder. "I like to think I would have liked him." "You would have," he said. "You have exactly the same stubborn practical decency." She laughed, which was a sound he had decided was one of the best sounds in his available catalog, warm and real and entirely itself. "I will take stubborn practical decency," she said. "It was the highest compliment I know how to give," he said. They stayed on the ridge until the cold drove them down, and they went back to the ranch for coffee and the ordinary morning was very fine. By the spring of 1875, the ranch had settled into the kind of steady, productive rhythm that is the goal of every working operation and the achievement of relatively few. The cattle herd was in excellent condition. The accounts were the best they had been in years. The kitchen garden was already being planned for its second expanded season, and the school in town was running with enough regularity and reputation that a family who had heard about it from relatives in Albuquerque had specifically cited it as a reason for relocating to Harrow Creek. Jane found out she was expecting their child in April. She waited a few days, not from uncertainty, but from the private pleasure of knowing something important before anyone else did. And then she told Joseph on a Wednesday evening after supper, while they were sitting on the porch in the early spring dark. He went very still in the way that he went still when something had moved him past the range of immediate expression. Then he reached over and took her hand and held it for a long moment without speaking. "Are you well?" he said finally. "I am very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but otherwise quite well. You will tell me if that changes. You will be the first to know," she said. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, which was a gesture he had started doing sometime in the winter, and that she had never asked him about because she did not need the explanation. "A child," he said, as though testing the weight of the word. "Our child," she said. He looked at her in the dark with eyes she could feel even before they were visible. "Our child," he said. He said it again more quietly, as though saying it twice made it more real, which perhaps it did. The news made its way through the ranch with the speed of news in small, close communities, which is to say instantly. Rodrigo appeared at breakfast the following morning looking as close to actively happy as Rodrigo got, which meant his customary neutrality had an expression embedded in it like sunlight in still water. Pilar embraced Jane and said several things in rapid Spanish that Jane understood enough of to be touched. Percy said, "That is the best news this ranch has had since Mrs. Blackwell fixed the accounts," which was perhaps not the traditional response but was entirely sincere. Walt said nothing at all but brought a piece of very good timber he had been saving for an unspecified purpose to the barn and began making something, and the something turned out, 3 weeks later, to be a cradle of excellent workmanship. Joseph finished the cradle himself, adding the final joinery and sanding the wood until it was smooth as polished stone, and he set it in the room that had been Jane's before they married, and that was now being turned into a nursery. Jane's pregnancy was uncomplicated, which she considered a mercy and a grace. She kept teaching through the summer, modifying only when the heat required it, and she kept the accounts and the household management and the correspondence with the school board that was forming in town, which was a new development she had helped set in motion, and that was moving with the pleasing momentum of an idea whose time had come. She gave up the teaching in late summer only because Rodrigo had, in his quiet way, informed Joseph that he thought Jane ought to rest more, and Joseph had passed this view along with considerable delicacy, and Jane had argued the point for exactly 2 days, and then conceded because she was tired, and the children were fine, and Rosa Sandoval could manage the school admirably with Mrs. Hayes filling in on the grammar lessons. September came, hot and golden, and Jane Blackwell was sitting on the porch in the big chair Joseph had brought out specially for her to have the afternoon air reading, when Pilar appeared in the doorway and looked at her with the assessing eye of a woman who has seen these matters before and said, "Come inside. It is time." The baby was born on the 14th of September, 1875, in the room with the window that looked toward the bluff. The midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Ochoa, who had been attending births in Harrow Creek, and the surrounding ranches for 15 years, presided with calm efficiency. Joseph sat in the hallway outside the door in a state of suspended internal weather that he later described to Rodrigo as the most afraid he had ever been, which was saying something for a man who had been through a cattle drive in a lightning storm and a flash flood in the creek. The baby announced itself with the committed thoroughness of a healthy set of lungs. It was a boy. Joseph was allowed into the room, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at Jane in the bed, pale and exhausted and so beautiful it undid him, and at the small bundle that Pillar was moving with expert hands, and something happened to his face that he did not bother to control. He went and sat beside her, and she turned her head and looked at him, and she was smiling the full smile, the one that was all of her. "A boy," she said. "A boy," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. She held the baby out to him, and he took him with the careful completeness of a man who understands he is holding something important, settling the small weight against his chest. The baby had a quantity of dark hair, squinted eyes, and the decisive scowl of someone who has opinions about their current situation. "He looks annoyed," Joseph said. "He has just had a very demanding morning," Jane said. Joseph looked down at the small face and thought about his father on the ridge in his mother's hands and the 4,000 acres below the bluff and the prayer that had arrived with no name and just an asking for courage, and he thought that here was every reason all of it had been worth keeping. "What shall we call him?" Jane said. They had discussed names without quite settling. Now Joseph looked at her over the baby's dark head and said, "James, after your father." Her eyes filled. She had not expected that. She had known he would not suggest a name for his own father, because his father's name was already on the land and did not need to be repeated in this new generation. But her father's name she had not thought to ask for. "James," she said softly, "James Blackwell." "James William Blackwell," Joseph said, adding a nod. "William was my grandfather's name. It seems like a name that ought to carry some weight." "It is a good name," she said. "It is a very good name." James William Blackwell slept against his father's chest with the absolute confidence of someone who has found the right place and intends to stay. And outside the window the afternoon was gold and quiet, and the cottonwoods along the creek were beginning to turn. The years that followed were the kind that people who have them understand, without needing to explain to anyone else, as the real wealth of a life. They were not without difficulty, because nothing on the frontier was without difficulty, the land requiring constant attention and the weather never quite apologizing for itself, and the territory continuing to sort itself into the shape it would eventually become, with all the complexity that involved. There was the spring of 1876 when a drought came hard and stayed 2 months longer than expected, and Joseph made the difficult decision to sell a portion of the cattle early rather than watch them suffer through inadequate water. And Jane managed the household budget through that lean period with the mathematical creativity of someone who has done this kind of management before and knows that the first rule is honesty about what you have. They came through it lean but whole, and the following year's breeding season restored the herd, and Joseph had made the right call, which Jane told him plainly when it was clear. There was the matter of the school's permanence, which Jane finished engineering in the fall of 1876 when she succeeded in establishing a formal school district with its own board, its own budget drawn from a property tax levy, and a full-time teacher whose salary was funded accordingly. She stepped back from teaching at that point, not without some wistfulness, to give the new teacher full authority, but she remained on the school board and stayed the practical force behind the institution for years. There was a period in 1877 when Percy, who had grown into a genuinely skilled hand and was now 23, announced that he was leaving to start his own small operation in the northern part of the territory with a woman he intended to marry, whose name was Lucia, and who he brought to the ranch so that Jane and Joseph could meet her before the wedding. Lucia was 21, sharp-minded and funny in a way that made Jane like her immediately, and Joseph shook Percy's hand and told him he was welcome back to the Blackwell Ranch any time he needed work, but that he thought Percy was going to do fine on his own. Percy cried a little, which he then denied having done, and Rodrigo looked on with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching something he raised go out into the world. James Blackwell, who had his father's dark hair and his mother's forward-leaning way of approaching everything, was 2 years old when he first attempted to climb the fence of the horse corral and was intercepted by Walt, who had developed an inexplicable but genuine fondness for the child and served as a kind of unofficial guardian whenever James's range of exploration exceeded what the household was paying attention to. Jane was expecting their second child in the spring of 1878. She told Joseph in January, and he reacted the way he had the first time, with that absolute stillness, and then the slow, warm completeness of a man who has been given something he did not quite dare to expect again. 2, he said. 2, she confirmed. James is going to be very interested, he said. James is going to be very dramatic about it for approximately a week and then claim it was his idea, she said. Joseph laughed, the full laugh that she had taken considerable pleasure in earning over the years, and she smiled, and they sat together in the morning kitchen with the coffee and the early light coming through the east window while James slept in the nursery. And it was an ordinary morning, and ordinary mornings in this kitchen were among the things Jane Atwood, now Jane Blackwell, counted as the finest the territory had to offer. The second baby arrived in April, a girl this time, born with less drama than James and more decisiveness about her initial impressions of the world. She looked at everything with wide, serious eyes from the beginning, as though cataloging it. They named her Margaret for Joseph's mother, and she was called Maggie before she was a week old, which suited her better anyway. She had Jane's brown hair and, from the earliest evidence, a temperament that was going to be considerable. Rodrigo, when he held her for the first time on the porch while Jane was resting, looked at her small, serious face and said, "She is going to be a great deal of trouble." "Good trouble," Jane said from her chair. "Yes," Rodrigo said with something that was unmistakably fond. "Good trouble." Walt made her a rocking horse. Percy and Lucia came from their ranch 3 days' ride to the north and brought a gift of a hand-knitted blanket that Lucia had made, and Percy tried to take credit for until Lucia stopped him with a look. By the summer of 1878, the Blackwell Ranch had 2 children, a school that was running well without Jane's daily attention, a cattle herd that was the envy of several neighboring operations, accounts that had been in the black for 3 consecutive years, and a kitchen garden that supplied not only the ranch table but a regular charitable contribution to the families in town who found the winters hard. Joseph was 36. Jane was 31. James was 2.5 and had recently become fascinated by horses to a degree that kept Walt in a state of productive vigilance. Maggie was 3 months old and already had opinions about the arrangement of her own blanket. On a Saturday evening in August, when the heat had broken into a cooler night than the summer had been delivering, Jane and Joseph sat on the porch after supper while Pillar managed the children's bath and the household settled into the evening quiet. The stars were coming out over the bluff, the same stars they had watched together on this porch through 5 years of evenings, and they were familiar and not diminished by the familiarity. Joseph had his arm around her and she was leaning against him in the comfortable architecture of 2 people who have learned each other's weight and warmth well enough to fit together without adjustment. She said, "Do you remember the letter?" "Every word," he said, without hesitation. She smiled. "I meant every word of it," she said. "Grant me courage enough to go where I have never been." "You had more than enough," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "You walked 4 miles in the cold and told a stranger what you could offer him without flinching," he said. "That is what terrified looks like when it goes forward anyway." She was quiet for a moment. "And did wherever you are going ever feel like home?" He turned his head to look at her, and the lamp from the window was behind him and his face was in the shadow, but she knew it exactly, every line of it, every expression it carried. "The day you walked through the gate," he said, "that was when this became home." "You didn't know me then," she said. "No," he said, "but the gate is the gate. Something changes when a person comes through it the right way." She looked out at the dark yard, at the shape of the barn against the stars, at the line of the cottonwoods, at the ground she had walked from the gate to the porch on the first morning, not yet knowing any of it. "I am glad I wrote the prayer," she said. "I am glad Hayes brought it to me," he said. "I am glad I could not stop thinking about it. I am glad you came through the gate. I am glad you were on the porch when I did," she said. The night was warm and very quiet, the kind of quiet that only exists when things are at rest, not waiting for something but actually resting in what they are. From inside the house came the sound of James singing something with Pillar, the words unclear but the tune earnest and slightly off-key. Maggie's small voice joined it briefly from wherever she was being held, a sound that was more enthusiasm than melody. Joseph pressed his mouth to Jane's temple, the way he had of doing this, unhurried and certain. She closed her eyes and felt the warmth of him and the warmth of the evening and the deep settled permanence of this place that had been waiting for her before she knew it existed. "Lord, grant me courage enough to go where I have never been, grace enough to be useful where I land, and enough good sense to know a worthy man when I find one." She had found one. She had walked 4 miles in the cold to find him. She had been useful from the first morning and had not stopped. She had kept her hands steady and her heart open, and it had led her here to this porch, to this man, to this land under these stars in this good life that was hers and his and theirs together. "Keep my hands steady and my heart open, and if it pleases you, let wherever I am going feel someday like home." From the inside of the house, James's singing got louder and more confident, and Pillar laughed, and Maggie made the sound of a baby who has found something satisfying about the current moment. And Joseph Blackwell, who had turned down every woman the town had offered him and then been undone by an unsigned prayer, sat on his porch with his wife in the August dark and felt the full weight of what a life can be when the right person walks through the gate. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The morning would bring work, as it always did. The fence lines and the cattle and the accounts and the school board, and the 10,000 small necessary things that made up the keeping of a life on this land, in this territory, in this time. There would be droughts and good years and the ordinary worries and the occasional extraordinary ones. And there would be James growing up and Maggie growing up, and perhaps other children in the rooms of this house, if it pleased the same providence that had sent a prayer across the territory in an unmarked envelope. But tonight was this, and this was whole and complete and true, and Jane Blackwell pressed her hand flat against her husband's chest and felt his heart beat steady under her palm. And the stars came out one by one over the bluff until the whole sky was full of them. And Harrow Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the year of 1878, held all of it without complaint, as good land does, as good home does, as love does when it has found the right place to take root and has been given at last. The grace to grow,